Okay, this is going to be a first time for me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how a tool that has been used in higher education and touted as one that will reduce inequality has actually created more inequality than what it was supposed to do in the first place. So I'm talking about meritocracy. And in a way, on a reflection, this title of this talk should have been Meritocracy and its Discontents. Because what we show from a study that we have done over the last 2.5 years, and it's called the International ISEE, which is the International Science Education Assessment, which was done over 2.5 years by 300 over experts from about 45 countries, from over multiple disciplines. So one of the very important things we found from this exercise is how transdisciplinary really brings in new insights into education. It provides a platform for experts from one discipline to interact with other disciplines who are working on the same issue, but they have no clue about the work that they have done. And so this was a very interesting exercise. It took over 2.5 years. Now, some of the key messages and recommendations. So the report is presented as a very short key messages, which is about 5 pages long. Then we have, these are for people with very short attention spans, pardon my pun. Then we have what we call a summary for decision makers, which is about 50 pages. And that basically synthesizes and brings into everything that has been done over the 2.5 years to answer questions that policymakers are interested in. Not what maybe researchers are, but what policymakers are. To support the summary for decision makers is a 4-volume report, which approximately is about 1,200 over pages. So the whole idea was to do something like what they do for climate change. The IPCC reports, done every 5 years, brings in the most prominent experts who have been working in the field to sort of say, what do we know about the system that we are looking at? And in this particular case, the system that we are looking on is the education system. This is even the first of its kind in education. And so it was a little bit of a challenge bringing in the different experts because they've never been working in this type of environment, and especially when they have very, very different perspectives and approaches towards education. Now, one of the things that came out that I wanted to, there were 7 key messages, I'm not going to go through all of them, is personalized education for flourishing is a human right. Now, I'm sure you must have heard again and again from within this first half day or 3/4 days that education is a human right. Comes from the 1946 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 26 says that very clearly. Now, what's different here is it says a personalized education is a human right, because what's happened since then is that we have been providing a one-size-fits-all kind of an education system to every student. Now, some of them benefit from that, maybe 10, 20%, but the remaining 80% are not suited to that, and so they struggle. And in many ways, it was very surprising that the average of learning poverty, defined as a kid who is 10 years old, who is not able to read and comprehend, the global average is about 54%. I think it was in 2019, pre-COVID. And they estimate that now post-COVID is going to go up to 63%. That's telling us that even before COVID, 53% of our kids at the age of 10 were not able to read and comprehend, although enrollment rates were going up, so-called literacy rates were going up, but that was not what's important. It's you have to learn and comprehend. So the whole idea of a personal education came out from that, is sort of you tailor it to every student. They call it the holy grail of education. Can we do it? People will say, come on, we have so many kids, we have limited teachers. Digital education provides a solution, not the complete solution, but a hybrid, and digital is able to provide that. The next thing, learning is a cognitive, emotional process. Now, what's important here is that we have looked at education purely as a cognitive exercise, purely as an intellectual. It's about knowledge dissemination and knowledge generation. But we know now from science and from evidence that learning is influenced by emotions, and emotions influence learning. And so what you learn is going to be influenced by emotions. And many of us, the teacher might be saying certain things, the emotional state of each child will dictate what exactly that child learns, which will be very different. And they've shown this conclusively. Tons of papers of that. So you have to take what we call a whole brain approach. Again, this whole notion of the thinking brain, the feeling brain, the right brain, the left brain, it's completely now been thrown out of by most of the neuroscientists. It's about neural networks. It's about the networks that link the different parts of the brain. Because there are the networks, and if we train the cognitive and not the emotional, then the learning that comes out is dominated by the cognitive, but not the emotions. Or the emotions are raw emotions. And now we know that we can train emotions. Emotion regulation. Many schools have started introducing these things under the rubric of mindfulness. So social and emotional learning is what they're talking about. Very, very pronounced in Canada. In fact, certain states like British Columbia have already, it's mandated in their policies. And I remember now with the new US administration under Biden, his new Secretary of Education has emphasized social-emotional learning as to be an integral part of the schooling system. The third, that science and evidence must be the foundation for education policy. I think it's good to get people's views. I think it's good to go out and talk to people and say what you expect. But, again, you don't want our policies to be based on opinions. Right? You must have the science and the evidence. So one of the examples that I always give is we went and talked to a lot of young people, and they basically felt that education is purely a cognitive exercise. And when we talked about the whole notion of the links with emotions, then they and then after a discussion, they said, yeah, that's right. Emotions do play a part as well. It has to be part of the curriculum. It has to be part of the pedagogy. It has to be part of the assessments as well. So I use the word flourishing. What does that mean? So if you look at that, human flourishing, I'm not sure if I have the, here it is. It's the optimal continuing of the development of human beings' potential. It's about the individual. It's not about the group, but it's about, start with the individual. Because once the individual is in a comfortable space, is in a stable emotional state, everything else falls into place. But that emotional state is also dependent on others. We don't live in a vacuum. We are a social species, and we interact with others. So, and living well as a human being, I think in the previous plenary, when they talked about the futures, they talked about community and about being the person, the human. Here it is, which means being engaged in relationships and activities that are meaningful, that is aligned with both their own values and humanistic values in a way that is satisfying to them. So it is very agency-driven. It's not about a top-down imposition of these are the values. I come from the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Development. And very early on, they said, we must do values education. My response is, whose values? Am I to take Gandhian values? Am I supposed to take, there's a whole bunch of values. So the response is, why don't we build the competencies among our children for them to define those values in their own search? It's a lifelong journey. Hopefully our values change over time, right? I think once values don't change, I think that's when we become dogmatic, because our environment is changing. The interactions with different people, cultures change. Our values are malleable and dynamic. So, flourishing is key for education. And what we have found in the assessment is there are basically two major schools, with one school dominating the whole education system, and that's the human capital school. Build human capital. What is human capital? Literacy, numeracy, enrollments, and wages. So basically, build humans for the economic system. Right? For want of a better word, build slaves. Right? So flourishing has to be the key for our education system. If you want a new social contract, as what UNESCO is talking about, the new social contract has to make it clear it's for human flourishing the way we have defined over here. It's about potentials and living with others as well. And living with other sentient beings, not just with the human species, but with all other living species. So the whole notion of potentiality emerged. And what do I mean by potentiality? Because remember, we want to improve the potentials of humans. So potentiality is about me and using me as the benchmark and evaluating the changes that I have experienced over time. Now, of course, we are going to say numeracy. You need to know how to do addition, subtraction, basic maths, algebra later and stuff. We have those. But I'm not going to be evaluated against a group of people. I'm going to be evaluated as where my knowledge stands today, and then with the learning interventions, I'm evaluated continuously to see whether I have improved from where I was before. And any improvement is a learning process. And you do it in your own time and pace. So some might really go very quickly in algebra, but be caught in geometry, whereas others might move much more. That's okay, but you're against yourself. Be your own benchmark, is what I say. So you get rid of what I'm going to come to, the whole notion of meritocracy and credentials. Because you don't need that anymore. I still remember during my school days, I remember coming, and my mom really hates me when I give this example, is that I came back after one of these pesky exams. Everybody sits there, 300 of us sit there, teacher says start, and then you're timed in a 1.5 hour or 3 hour, and you're just writing over them. And then you get your marks. And then you're graded, right? Against the paper, and then you're ranked in the class. So I come back very happy saying, I've got 89 out of 100. And my previous exam in the same thing was 75. So I'm really happy. I'm so 88. The first thing my mom says is, so who was the highest? I'm like, what? And sure, the highest was 99. And she said, well, you haven't really improved. I was like, that's not what matters. I have improved within myself, and I will still keep improving, and that's what it is. So the whole notion of that meritocracy, because that was based on meritocracy, right? And then you get into the real world, they're going to start looking at where you are, your credentials and stuff. So it's a vicious cycle that we have created ourselves. So we keep talking about equality, we talk about inclusion, and then yet we still keep this merits-based system. And remember, the merits are based on your environment. If I come from a rich family, I come from a family of professors, and I come from a family of intellectuals, I'm going to have a better learning environment than somebody else. Doesn't say that I'm smarter. But it also doesn't say I'm dumber, that I just got by because of this. I have to still work hard as well. So there's a great book by Daniel Markovits called The Meritocracy Trap. And he documents this. And what he shows that in the US, the top 60% of kids in the top 10% of the universities, come from the top 10% of the richest families. So you're mirroring the inequality in income in education. It's a mirroring image. So agency is important. Context is critical. You need to understand the context where they're coming from. And then meaningful relationships with self, others, and other living beings. That's human flourishing. And so an unfair advantage. In the US, you can see the majority of students are from the top 1% of income distributions, the top 60%. This is Markovits, 2009. Peter Sandler or Mendler also has something else. The UK, the Russell Group is basically very similar of the Ivy Leagues in the US. It's about 22 universities. Again, the top 19% income quintile make the majority of the students. India, caste becomes a major component. So those who are in the higher caste tend to dominate all the most dominant universities. And China is the same, the C9 League. So it seems to be part of our higher education system. And if you're thinking of remodeling or rethinking of higher education and using the words of social justice, equity, and inclusion, you've got to get rid of meritocracy. You have to come up with another solution. What we are suggesting is potentiality. Now, how to get there? The whole brain approach. Learning happens from an interconnected neural network. That's well documented. Connecting cognition and emotion. Training in one area results in certain outcomes versus expected when training in all areas, and emotions play a significant role in learning. So you got to, I've worked a large chunk of my whole career on the whole notion of human functionings and human flourishing. And the thinking was it was a state. And now the latest research from some of the neuroscientists are saying flourishing is a competency. You can train for it. Same way we train numeracy and literacy, you can train the soft skills, the so-called soft skills. Although I think the soft skills, people think of soft skills as easy. The soft skills are the really most difficult ones. So we in the Institute have developed, we played with Einstein's equation, so we came up with this EMC squared approach. These are what we call the foundational competencies. So we've got mindfulness, which basically talks about emotion regulation and attention regulation. This is about building working memory, right? So these are foundational competencies that you need. If you don't have attention regulation, you're going to have really difficulty in learning. Kids who have, for some reason, wired with attention, only spend time in the class and they really do well in exams. They don't need to go back and keep studying it because it's the attention regulation. And they have found that with an introduction of mindfulness, a 10-week introduction of mindfulness increases academic scores from 7 to 11 points. That's a whole grade. And that's been repeated in many, many settings. Then we have empathy. Empathy is understanding the other. And then you have cognitive empathy, means you basically intellectually understand the other. The affective empathy is feeling the other. On how would you feel if you were in that? So it becomes an emotional state. And you have techniques to train empathy. Empathy is not natural. And then you have the compassion, which means action, doing something about that empathy, other than just being empathetic and then say, I can't do anything about it, and continue with life, which is what most of us do. But here you say, no, I want to do something about it. Even if it's a small step, I want to do. That's action. And I think putting that into like a project-based curriculum, you can get compassion as action part of the whole curriculum. And we have tried this in many schools. And then, of course, the critical inquiry is important. Ask the questions. Because you can have a mindful person, an empathetic person, and a compassionate person, and yet you can get a suicide bomber. The critical inquiry will make that challenge. Challenge, challenge, challenge. Question, question, question. Many teachers become very uncomfortable when I say that. Many parents become very uncomfortable because I sort of say, challenge when you have been told something. Feel comfortable with it, then move on. And then the whole pedagogy, in terms of rather just having a one way of teaching, we're thinking about storytelling, narrative-based, games. This is really popular with the kids, games and gamification. And we have a couple of programs where we have taken commercial games and played with the kids and built a curriculum around it. So there's one on migration. There's a game on migration, and we talk and introduce kids to what is a migrant, what do you mean? You get empathy training, how do you feel? And this is based on a game on a real life story of a migrant who went through that. And then we have one on violence. That's an interesting one. And identity. The kids really get excited about the identity game. And in all of this, the assessments are built into this. So the games already have the assessments. It's a continuous, when I say assessments, the exams, the tests. So you progress as you learn. The learning is the testing. You don't sit for this one snapshot time where you have questioned of what all you have learned. It's continuous. So we have done this, I just wanted to finish off with this program we call SEEK. It's a 40-hour program. We are now running it with a number of universities, 11 universities, 16,000 students have already signed up. It's a credit course. It's an elective. It's not compulsory, but now we are working with some of the authorities to make it as a mandatory course for every student in undergraduates. 40 online self-paced, and some of the testimonials have been great. We didn't pay the students, but in fact, when I was sitting and listening to some of those testimonials, I looked at my team and said, did you prime these guys to say these things? Because it was sounding a little bit really, but they said no. In fact, they were as surprised as us. So it really is really useful, especially now with post-COVID, when there's so much of stress, so much of anxiety. This program addresses those. And how do you manage stress? How do you manage anxiety? Remember, depression now is, I think, the number one or the second disease among young people. And I think in the medical faculty, depression is now being classified as a disease. Suicide rates among university students is one of the highest. Depression rates in India, for example, among 13 to 15-year-olds, 25% of kids between 13 to 25, between 13 and 15, have some form of mental health. That's 1 in 4. And this is reported. So imagine, because there's so much taboo around that. Most kids these days are anxious and they are stressed. And if we are talking about higher education and if we don't talk about stress and anxiety, we are kidding ourselves. So if you go to any of these discussions over the next 3 days, and if they don't talk about anxiety and depression, you should bring it up and say, look, this is one of the biggest issues in the universities. In India, in fact, they passed a law that the ceiling fans in the dormitories must collapse when anything more than 40 kilos hangs from it. Why? Because kids were hanging themselves from the ceiling fans. And, you know, young girl, 40 kilos is about right. So the minute it falls, so what do? They jump out of the buildings. That's not the solution. So it's really, we need to rethink about the curriculums and what we bring to those kids and the competencies that we're providing them. So you can download the report. It has most of the publications. There's a very short version. I have copies of that I can share with you. Then there's a summary for decision makers, which is about 50 pages. And then, of course, the 4 volumes, which goes through all the different aspects on curriculums, on assessments, and so forth and so on. And if you go to MGIEP UNESCO.org, you can get the modules that we are talking about. We have built our own learning platform. We did not want to use any of the private companies like Google's and Microsoft's. We built our own. We invested in building one. It took about 2.5 years. We've been experimenting, but now we have about 100,000 users. It's GDPR compliant. And we hope to get more and more students on that platform. Thank you very much.